Thanks for clicking! Canada's housing shortage has been far overstated and won't be fixed by building new condos. This according to a recent note coming from Benjamin Wrights of the Bank of Montreal. And yeah, the note comes at an opportune time as we're hearing from our, maybe not, elected officials that they plan on addressing Canada's housing crisis by massively increasing the pace of home building. And while I haven't really addressed any of the campaign promises to do with housing on this channel, as since I just assumed they're lying, I don't really see the point of going over the details.
Why?
I think Wrights' note might give us some insight into this election campaign, as he stresses what we've already discussed before on this channel, that the housing supply issue isn't as big of a problem as many have been saying. So what I want to do today is go over Wrights' note, take a look at how it compares to previous reports that we've seen on the supply issue in Canada's housing market, and then compare this data to the narrative being posited by our elected officials. As we'll see today, and we've seen in other videos, Canada's housing supply problem has been vastly overstated, with the data just not matching the narrative. We will obviously continue to track Canada's housing market with a data-driven approach on this channel. Make sure you click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, let's get into the Bank of Montreal. On to the Bank of Montreal. First off, just a brief note on sourcing. I do usually like to rely on the primary source rather than secondary sources like Better Dwelling, which first initially reported on this BMO note. I would rather just look at and present the report myself rather than relying on someone else's commentary on that report, as I don't really trust anyone in the media or the real estate industry for obvious reasons.
I mean, you've earned that.
But this report being referenced by Better Dwelling wasn't available on Google, and I couldn't find it on BMO's website. As such, I emailed Benjamin Wrights myself, who was kind enough to send me the originals, which correspond perfectly to those being reported by Better Dwelling. And I do have to say that not only was that quite nice of them, looking at the history of BMO's research, they almost are always the sharpest ones on the block. Always well researched, having even had to point out to Scotiabank a few years ago that Canada was in the G7, after Scotia had said that Canada's housing supply was the worst in the G7, and the media and the you-know-who ran on it, even though the Bank of Montreal pointed out quite rightly that Canada was in fact part of the G7 and had better housing supply than the United States. Regardless, while I always try to link my sources in the description, this BMO note won't be in the description since it's not available, from what I can tell, out on the internet, but feel free to pause the video if you want to look at the actual note yourself. Moving on, according to the report, Canada's housing supply problems really only became an issue in the post-pandemic era, when immigration really started to ramp back up. And we can see this clear as day in the graph with the number of people per housing unit actually moving down during the pandemic housing boom. And this isn't the first time that BMO has been right on the money on Canada's housing supply myth, articulated by Doug Porter in early 2022, and Robert Kavchik, also of BMO, throwing some cold water on that myth also in early 2022, demonstrating the building supply mismatch. And remember, back in 2021, right around here, the Liberals were telling us they planned on building 1.4 million new homes, the Conservatives told us they were going to build 1 million, and the NDP told us they were going to build 500,000 affordable units in the next 10 years, with each party saying this was the solution to Canada's housing affordability problem. Sound familiar?
A weird pattern.
And here's the important part. According to the note from BMO, it was after the pandemic housing boom that the housing supply actually got worse, and continued to get worse right up until recently. Yet, according to the CREA, even with housing supply getting continually worse, house prices have actually gotten better. If we pull the data on newly constructed homes ourselves, we can see that new housing starts are actually down since 2021. Combine that with the BMO note showing housing supply is worse, the CREA data showing that prices are down, and RBC telling us that affordability has actually gotten better over the past few months, and expected to continue that way, all of that tells me that it was never really housing supply in the first place, despite what our elected officials were insisting to us during the 2021 election campaign. So that was back then. We thought there was a big supply problem at the exact point that there wasn't. Our leaders told us that they needed to fix the supply problem that didn't exist. Moving on, the supply problem actually got continually worse, and prices got better, depending on who you are.
I had a car.
So that was then. How about now? Where are we going moving forward? Well, according to Wrights' report, Canada only needs to build another 600,000 houses to return to 2016 levels of housing supply. A far cry from the millions being promised by our elected officials.
It's your money.
And I think that gives us some insight heading into Election Day, as it's pretty clear from all of the data, both from Rightsys, the CREA, from RBC, that housing supply was never the real issue, even though our elected officials told us that it was. It's not even that they didn't keep their promises on how to fix the problem, it's that they weren't even correct on identifying the problem in the first place. Either all three leaders didn't know, which is a problem, or they did know and told us it was supply anyway, which is a problem in and of itself. Now, obviously, or not, this is not to place the blame of Canada's housing crisis on any one party in particular. And it's obviously not to place the blame on any one party in particular either. And it's obviously not to say that this isn't the total fault of President Trump, and also not to say that he's not the next Abraham Lincoln of this generation.
You son of a...
But what this is to say is that these parties have a demonstrable interest in sidestepping the real problem with housing affordability, in that house prices have vastly outpaced real income over the past 20 years. Now, very briefly, those prices might seem a little bit higher than we're used to seeing from the CREA data. There was a problem in putting the comparison of prices and incomes together, as Stats Canada only gives us the average income priced in 2022 constant dollars. As such, I had to go back and get all of the average prices provided by the CREA and convert them into 2022 constant dollars using the Bank of Canada's inflation calculator, so that everything would be inflation adjusted and match right up. It did take a bit of extra time, however, it does provide us with a much more accurate picture of the extent to which house prices have far outpaced income since 2005.
This makes us look bad, doesn't it, that we didn't know?
Well, these are the reports on the election and housing affordability that you provided people, both in 2021 and most recently in 2025.
It's not great.
Regardless, as we've discussed before on this channel, ultra-high house prices is not really something that the government wants fixed. We're all well aware of the amount of money that was lent out by the banks during 2020, 2021, and 2022, at least the early parts of 2022. And if prices fall too much, well, that's a lot of money that was lent out by the banks against depreciating assets, which, as we've said before on many videos, could very well lead to a bank problem, which the government is even more fearful of than you and I.
Now I gotta turn my back.
So, Rights is putting out this note just in time for the election as a stark reminder. I'm not sure if that was his intent, but it works as a stark reminder that what we were told about Canada's housing supply issues 4 years ago turned out to be not the case whatsoever. As we said, it's not so much a problem that our elected officials don't follow through on their promises to fix certain problems. Rather, they don't even correctly identify the problem to begin with. With that said, we will continue to track Canada's housing market on this channel. Make sure you click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates. But for now, thanks so much for watching.